Hello, and on behalf of the World Economic Forum, welcome to this session on society, trade, and COVID-19. Over the next hour, we'll explore different ways trade affects society, how the COVID-19 pandemic is changing this dynamic, and what actions can be taken to improve societal outcomes. Please go to slido.com and enter event code MC2020 Society. There you can ask the panelists your questions and answer the poll question, which is, what aspect of society is most affected by trade changes in the context of COVID-19? If you're joining us through TopLink, you can also post your questions in the Zoom Q&A window. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce Pierre Haber, who is General Secretary of the Trade Union Advisory Committee to the OECD. Pierre, thank you for agreeing to chair this session. Over to you.
Thank you, Aditi, and welcome to all. It's a pleasure and a honor to accompany you all in a conversation on the trade impacts or how international trade affects society at large. A conversation, a topic that has been addressed many times in the past, and I'm sure it will be an ongoing conversation. Trade affects society in many ways, as we know. Consumers, international trade liberalization helps a lot for consumers to access affordable good, quality, choice. It's also a force for good for SMEs in terms of market opportunities, perhaps also for SMEs to diversify the risks in terms of in their own development strategies. And among others, trade liberalization helps access to new sources of innovation for developing countries, for emerging economies. Is it always a force for good? That's one of the key questions, and that's a question that my constituency, the labor movement, has been asking a number of times. There are some risks, as we know. A trade liberalization, international trade is a shock, whether it's positive or negative. It creates a shock in an economy. So there is a risk for what we call the race to the bottom when it comes to environmental matters, when it comes to labor rights, as we know. Theoretically, these trade shocks can be handled domestically if you have the right policy tools, but that's a theory. So we're having this conversation in the very exceptional circumstances that we know, COVID-19, the worst possible crisis ever. The OECD just released new figures today, showing that in just 3 months, all the employment gains that we have painfully accumulated for the last 10 years since the last crisis have been wiped out. So, and the prospects are not necessarily good, as we may move into a world, a stop-and-go world with gradual confinement, deconfinement, a lot of uncertainty for business. There are 2 points that have been addressed by many of you, by many of us all. One is the reaction by some governments, perhaps not necessarily nationalistic, but entrenched, who've been indeed short-termist when it comes to their views of international trade. And then perhaps also a COVID crisis that have exposed that some failures in the international trade system, perhaps a high level of concentration. Some countries, some businesses are controlling perhaps a bit too much of the business in some sectors. So an old topic, but one that we'll have to revisit again and again in a world that perhaps a world that is in crisis and that will have to reach a new normality. And so to join us to feed in that conversation, I'm very pleased to introduce the panelists that will contribute. So first, Jesus Seade, who is the Undersecretary for North America at the Secretariat for Foreign Affairs of Mexico. Welcome. Jesus will be followed by Karen Bhatia, Vice President at the Government Affairs and Public Policy at Google. Following Jesus and Karen Bhatia and Karen contribution, we'll have a first round of discussion. So stay ready for for that first round. Following that first round, we'll have Penelope Nas, who is Senior Vice President International Public Affairs and Sustainability at UPS. Welcome, Penelope, who will also share thoughts. Then, since this is meant to be interactive, we'll have a second round of discussion. And we will end, last but not least, with Mr. Phil Hogan himself, the Commissioner for Trade at the European Commission. But before turning on to Jesus, let's perhaps look at the poll that Aditi mentioned, the poll results. If we can show them on the screen. Here we are. Okay, so you ask a question: what aspect of society is most affected by trade changes in the context of the crisis? And well, the jury is still out as what is the most one, because we have labor, employment, which I think could belong together, and competition. The other point that we raised are resilience, low-income households, inequality, SMEs, consumers, women, innovation, among others. So that's perhaps a first signal that was brought today. Let me turn to Jesus Seadin. Please go ahead. Please share your thoughts into that conversation.
Yes. Thank you very much. I thank the World Economic Forum for this invitation. A wonderful topic, couldn't be more topical. So the question that I am being asked to address is, how are global consumption and production affected by COVID? We have seen some pretty horrible crises in modern times. The global financial crisis of 2007-8 was one to remember or to forget. The crisis that engulfed emerging economies around the world that peaked in the year 1998 was even worse for those countries. But the bleak economic scenario resulting from COVID-19 simply goes well beyond any sense of crisis in living memory. The ongoing economic contraction represents a loss of income, employment, and economic activity as has not been seen in decades. The WTO estimates a fall in world trade this year of up to 1/3 and a decrease in income of 9%, while FDI is expected to fall by 40% and more so next year. But perhaps as importantly, this crisis is likely to have a greater impact on the world once it is gone. It's not just recovery, but permanent effect. The crisis and recovery, once the recovery starts, could take the shape of a V, ideally. It could be a U, slower recovery. It could even be a W with relapse, or even an L, a protracted L. Surely the crisis will hit different sectors and different countries differently, and may deepen gaps in incomes and in economic dynamics within countries and globally. So let me start with some comments on consumption side effects. First of all, social distancing is leading to a massive acceleration of technological take-up by companies wherever possible, and delivery of online services and distant provision of goods that will produce a surge in the globalization of services to deliver those goods. Some of these transformations will be driven by technology companies looking to compete for consumers among the millions of social and commercial interactions that will now be permanently online. But also, alongside the tech companies, many firms have been unable to meet the demand, the surge in demand for distant delivery resulting from the crisis. And I can see many businesses working to expand their ability to deliver by online means, going more digital and strengthening value chains in the long run. This is already happening at speed with many sectors where delivery has traditionally been in person, or primarily in person mostly, with the customer going to the producer. as you normally go to a shop, and where massive efforts are underway to expand delivery from the distance. This is true, for example, importantly, in sectors like education, including basic university level honors degrees, as opposed to postgraduates, where online delivery has been more common in the past. There are now huge numbers, for example, of Chinese students that represent a big part of the income through their fees, of the income of universities in the United States, in Europe, in Australia, that may now fall in numbers significantly, and therefore the income. And those universities are working, as we speak, working hard to develop new products and new forms of online delivery. The same goes for health services, financial services, retail, and entertainment. Against this ongoing expansion of digital delivery, sectors that cannot go digital are likely to lose out. We may see losses among retail outlets that do not go digital, from shopping malls to grocery stores, a number of which may not survive. Without major financial support, COVID-19 is going to disrupt a lot of urban commerce, a lot of the city centers as we know them. Another trend related to this one is that, also resulting from COVID, consumers are returning to brands, to big brands that they know and they trust. And as a result of this, between 1.4 million and 2.1 million small and medium enterprises in the US alone could permanently close only as a result of the first 4 months of the pandemic. It will get worse the longer this continues. This is a very perverse development because it is totally contrary to the increasing calls that we just heard from our friend and that are being made all around the world, the last maybe 10 years in particular, the last few years more, for the containment of globalization to protect more the weaker and the smaller producers at home, who are often unable to compete in the global marketplace, compete with the giant. The pandemic. On this question, let me mention that in the new United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, the NAFTA II, just completed, which I was chief negotiator of for Mexico, one of the beautiful innovations is an entire chapter on SMEs, where the governments have agreed to create space for governments to be able to support SMEs to access, for example, cheaper credit through syndications of their borrowing, or collectivization in their procurement, in their purchases to achieve better terms, or even creating collective brands where there are many independent producers feeding into the brand to gain scale that individually they lack. And that all these factors are, all of them, major factors why SMEs take a very small part in international trade. So we have agreed to do this, of great interest to the SMEs in Mexico, but also in the United States and Canada. And this is surely one idea that I would hope members at WTO might consider exploiting or exploring. Now, let me switch to production side effects. COVID-19 is also a shock on the supply side through trade measures. And the manufacturing sector in particular may be one that takes the biggest hit here. In terms of goods, trade is likely to fall more steeply in sectors characterized by complex value chain linkages, such as electronics, cars, aerospace, but also medicines and medical devices, both regionally and globally. But it is without doubt services trade that may be the most directly affected by COVID-19 through the imposition of transport and travel restrictions and the closure of many retail and hospitality establishments. In particular, a sharp fall in tourism and air travel will inevitably affect many countries by having an adverse effect on workers' incomes, including in particular developing countries, some of which rely heavily on this activity for foreign exchange income. A country like France is, of course, perhaps a champion in tourist income, but compared to other sources of income, tourism is particularly important for many developing countries. Let me close by saying a few words about opportunities for cooperation. As countries begin to remove measures taken to stem the spread of the pandemic, there is ample room for mutually beneficial cooperation, most probably through the good offices of a helpful global intermediator, which can be no other than the WTO. Countries should exchange comprehensive information on the dismantling of pandemic-related restrictive measures and of their plans. This is key for trading partners, upstream and downstream, trading partners of the country issuing these notifications. It's trading partners upstream selling parts and components to this country, and downstream buying its products will benefit from this knowledge of what is being liberalized and when, because they can then try to collectively manage the value chain. Otherwise, it can easily happen that I liberalize a sector and the sector cannot produce because it cannot get the parts or it cannot sell the product. So it is the right way to approach a collective restoration of those value chains as consistently and as non-chaotically as possible. Beyond this exchange of information, it's also important to commit, to the extent possible, to the non-retention of new barriers to trade, both exports and imports. Unlike protectionism on imports, actions being taken now on the export side in particular need to be monitored closely and removed as quickly as possible. And I would like to quote G20 trade ministers who agreed that, quote, the emergency measures to tackle COVID-19, if deemed necessary, must be targeted, proportionate, transparent, and temporary, and should not create unnecessary barriers to trade or disruption to global supply chains. To the extent that countries do follow this advice, which in the expression of the G20 is only advice, to the extent that they do follow this advice, to that extent, the recovery from the pandemic will be more successful for everybody, more harmonious, and therefore stronger and even shorter. In this regard, we must remember that even before the pandemic, and due to the trade tensions among major players, objectives of onshoring or near-shoring value chains began to take a lot of traction as ways to reduce dependence on specific suppliers. Some of the sentiment here can be understood as a means to reduce risk on that dependence, as a risk management process. But if that is the objective, then the medicine is quite wrong, because the way to handle risk is by not by onshoring or nearshoring, which creates the same risk, because if you get a storm in your country, then you lose the production. The right thing is to introduce means to diversify your procurement, not to depend so much on purchases from one champion in that good, which has been very much the tone of globalization, that the best company, the most competitive company becomes Walmart or becomes Facebook or becomes whatever, and takes the brunt of the market, Amazon, whatever, takes the brunt of the market. Maybe you want to diversify, but not to kill trade, not to onshore too much, because that will deny the long-established benefits for efficiency and mutual gain that come from trade, instead of duplication, loss of productivity, and loss of competitiveness, and therefore higher costs for the consumer. I think I can stop here. I'll be very happy to listen to other panel members and to respond to colleagues if there's any question that comes my way. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesus. I will not try to sum up what you said, but I'll just repeat 2 or 3 key words that I think were important. One is the structural impacts the structural consequences. Digitalization, there will be winners, there'll be sectors that are winners, there'll be losers, and we have to take that on board. You mentioned the new US MCA agreement, NAFTA 2, focusing on the SME chapter. As you can imagine, as a union person, I would be interested to have your view on the labor clause of that agreement, if you think it's the right one. But you also mentioned you warn against this temptation of onshoring, reshoring. If the intent is to diversify the risk, that's really an important one. I would myself have comment on that, but I'll leave it there, and I'll pass on the floor to. Thanks again. To Karen Bhatia from Google. So Karen, please, the floor is yours.
Pierre, thanks very much, and thanks to the WEF and to my fellow panelists for inviting me and putting this on. I think the question that I was asked to sort of think and speak a little bit about here is, what does accelerated digitalization mean for services, trade, and investment in the context of COVID and the post-COVID environment? So let me start just first of all, obviously, by acknowledging just how heartbreaking it is to see the damage that the pandemic has done and continues to do to so many people throughout the world, and also to acknowledge the incredible work that we see being done by so many governments, companies, NGOs, other institutions to try to tackle the challenge. I'll just, speaking on behalf of Google, I can tell you our 140,000 employees around the world really dropped everything a few months ago to start focusing on the crisis and think about what new products we could launch, services we could launch to try and tackle the pandemic. And everything from trying to use our existing platforms like search and YouTube to get authoritative information out to our users about the disease, to creating, innovating sort of on the fly, whole new solutions to address new challenges, like creating smartphone-based contact tracing, which we've done in partnership with Apple as an example. So anyway, turning a little bit to the topic though, and I guess it really is at the risk of stating the obvious, and Undersecretary Siade stated this very well, I think COVID has shown the absolutely critical role that digitalization and technology can play and have played in enabling economic resilience. And you just simply need to think about what our lives and our economies would have looked like over the last 4 months without technology, without online shopping, without video conferencing, without free and easy access to information. Clearly the damage that would have been done to economies and to lives would have been many multiples of what we saw. And I would flag that I think this has been particularly true for small businesses. For years, the availability of digital commerce has enabled SMBs to grow and to become global much faster. The evidence is that a small business is 5 times more likely to become an exporter once it starts using digital tools. And I think that small business dependency or tied to digitalization has been particularly true in the COVID environment. In the US and Canada, for example, 1/3 of consumers report that they're purchasing now from cross-border stores more often than before the outbreak. We've seen similar numbers in Italy and the Gulf countries. And it's having a positive impact on the businesses. In the US, there was a poll where 1/3 of small businesses surveyed said that without digital technology, they would have had to close all or part of their businesses during COVID. So look, the evidence, I think, is there clearly that digitalization has helped economies come through this. What's been more challenging, I think, is that from a government policy perspective, we see really discordant signals on this front. On the one hand, we see governments in many places very much looking to try to strengthen the digital component of their economy. So we see in stimulus plans a newfound interest in investing in digital infrastructure, which is terrific. We see a focus on skilling, on digital skilling. This is a place where we at Google have been particularly partnering with governments because it is so important, whether you're a school-age child or somebody advanced in your career looking to reskill, being familiar with digital skills, with digital concepts is critically important. So we do see that focus with governments. But on the other hand, we're also seeing in a lot of places around the world disturbing trends of turning inwards when it comes to digital policy. We see the growth of techno-nationalism, of protectionism, of data localization kinds of policies. And look, I think this is all concerning because for digitalization to really yield the broad benefits that we are hoping for, including in important measure in fighting the pandemic, you've got to be able to capture its benefits at a global scale. You know, it's got to be a global internet. And that means promoting real-time information sharing. That means enabling cross-border digital communications, ensuring robust distributed global networks, which is really what's going to enable or allow workers and students to come online without disruption, that businesses can continue operating, people can continue communicating and trading. There have been some positive steps, no questions. Let me give a big congratulations to Undersecretary Siade on this panel and his counterparts in the US government and in Canada, who were critical, obviously, in the USMCA negotiations. Not only did that agreement include a best-in-class digital chapter in USMCA, and I also would second his applause for the SME chapter that he referenced, but I saw that the Mexican Congress last week passed the first in a series of USMCA implementation laws, so that was terrific. And we've also seen in a different part of the world, Chile, New Zealand, Singapore, take a step forward last month with the signing of a digital economy partnership agreement, which was very encouraging. But these are just a few steps. And I think what's really needed is a global trade architecture that's responsive to these newly evident, newly compelling opportunities and challenges in the digital age. And that is really, you know, we have this opportunity before us with the WTO and the e-commerce negotiations that are going on. And I'll close on this note. I mean, if you think about the WTO's rules that were written now more than 25 years ago, you're not going to find the word internet. You know, the existing WTO agreements address some of the issues, but a lot more specificity and clarity is really needed to deal with modern digital issues like access to information, like platform-based trade, like artificial intelligence. It's exciting to see that there has been some progress on some of these issues in the initial rounds of the e-commerce negotiations, and to see that many WTO members agree on some of the key components, and that there's enthusiasm by both developed country members and by developing countries. And I would just sort of say, and close on this note, that this kind of global coordination really being done globally is critical, because digital technologies are by their definition global in design. That is the core of their power and their potential. And plurilateral and other initiatives, while helpful and to be applauded, are not going to be a resolution to these sort of broader global architectural challenges that we face. So I'll stop there and kick it back over to you, Pierre.
Thanks, Karan. So you mentioned, indeed, the digital tool. They were part of the solution in the early phase of the crisis. On government side, that there is perhaps the good, the bad, and the ugly, as I understand it, if I may say so. On the good things on infrastructure, on access to skills. The bad and the perhaps a bit ugly here has been, as we know, the rise of what you call, I think, techno-nationalism, or some kind of and you made a strong call for prevent this tendency toward data localization. You mentioned the digital chapter of the USMCA, and last but not least, a call for a new global trade infrastructure, and you see an opportunity with the e-commerce. And I must say, I feel a bit frustrated because my role is just to moderate things. I would love to contribute, but I'm not a panelist, so I'll stay clear and just we have a number of questions to you, Jesus, and to you, Karan. So let me just list, because Aditi has been kind enough to sum them up. These are very easy questions, so I'm sure you can handle them. One question is, will digital trade exacerbate inequality? That's the first question. An easy one. I'm sure you can answer that. What are the likely impacts on societies of economic nationalism we are seeing from some quarters? That's again, both of you have addressed this issue. And how can the WTO interact better with broader society? That I guess, you know, a white point among others, Karen, that you could bring in. You have a close eye on the e-commerce, but you know, sometimes from civil society, we see you talking to with governments and, you know, NGO, trade unions. We would also want to have a say, you know, stuff like that. And then last but not least is the NAFTA agreement a meaningful improvement for workers? That question does not come from me. I just want to make that clear. Voilà. So inequality, economic nationalism, WTO on substance, but also on process, and NAFTA and workers. You can pick and choose. You're not forced to to go through all those questions. Perhaps let's start with you, Jesus, if you want. Jesus, you need to unmute.
Please repeat the last question. I couldn't quite catch it.
Well, it's actually the question that I asked you is the new NAFTA, the USMCA agreement, a meaningful improvement, or does it constitute a meaningful improvement for workers? Mexican workers, American workers, Canadian workers. That was the last question.
Okay, let me. Maybe I can take the 4 questions, and then maybe Karen will come to the 4 questions if these are also for him, because they can be complementarities and things. Will digital trade exacerbate inequality? It can, but I think it fundamentally would not. This is not the Sorry, I was on silence. It's a good practice to silence your microphone to avoid echo, but it's not a good idea when you want to speak. So let me start all over again. And Karen can see that I'm not a techie, okay? No, I was saying that, digital trade, the expansion of technology can exacerbate inequality. From certain angles it will, but by and large, I think the fundamental effect is the opposite. This is not the 1970s or 80s, where advanced technology was the preserve of the United States and some European countries. Right now, countries like not only China, certainly, but India, of course, is a giant. I've been talking recently, countries like Pakistan or Turkey or countries in Latin America all have a take on that. And digital trade is in their interest as suppliers, as producers, and certainly also as users and consumers. And digital trade is an opportunity to expand availability, choice, and lower the price. So I think it is fundamentally a good thing for development and for equalization. It's called progress. You cannot say progress is a bad thing, but progress, badly taken, could be a disequalizer. If you do the right thing, it is not. The impact on welfare, on everything, of economic, of technological and economic nationalism. Well, I think it is the same as the old protectionism of always. You can always give small arguments why something could make sense, and that's why they can be appealing to politicians. But these are fundamentally excellent ways to shoot yourself in the foot, because economic nationalism generally, or economic nationally in the area of technology, is just a way to ensure that availability of technology is worse and more expensive to your society, and at the same time that you are going to make less of a leaping forward. What you have to do, if you are really a nationalist on that, is to put money on the fundamentals, education and scholarships and internships and things of that kind. And then you will be catching up, because if you are a developing country, if you are less rich, less endowed with technology than the big countries, you also have a competitive advantage on the side of salaries, not because you exploit, but because there is less productivity and incomes are lower. So give the wherewithal to your population through education and not by protectionism. How the WTO should interact with society? Well, I do believe that the WTO has a serious communications gap generally. So there has to be much more of a presence. You may have heard a rumor that I'm not here to confirm or deny, but some people say that I am a candidate to be the next Director General of WTO. And one thing that I have said to people I'm talking to is certainly a measurable amount of the Director General's time should be put into communication, into visiting countries, to elicit interest, to explain, to get them really on board, communicating in different ways, taking part in events like this one. I really believe that that communication is central to this organization. And then finally, the impact on workers. This was, I believe, addressed to the NAFTA too, to the USMCA. The impact on workers. Of course, it's a good thing. We have had a chorus of complaints for the last 30 years, not 25, before, predating NAFTA, complaints that Mexico had fallen into a bad practice regime towards workers called protection contracts that essentially froze salaries at a very low level. I have done my career mostly abroad. We can compete. And I really felt embarrassed to hear that, because how can you be proud that your salaries are low? And they were not low because of legitimate market forces. They were low because there were mechanisms to repress salaries. The new labor system is just bringing Mexico right to the front. It's a very ambitious labor reform that has been passed. It was passed close to unanimity across all the parties. So it's not just something that was passed, but has a political consensus in society. There's a backlog of good practice with companies, so there'll be years of adjustment. It has to be done. But what's wrong with ruling that there'll be no worker exploitation, no violence in the workplace, that workers can elect their representatives or decide whether they want to approve a collective contract, a collective bargaining contract. So I think it is a very good thing for workers and will result in higher salaries, but higher salaries that will begin to move into higher productivity as well. So I'm not scared about the future. I'm optimistic. I think I stayed, but happy to come back, Pierre. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jesus. And if I may, good luck with the unconfirmed, informal possibility. Who knows? Karen, please.
Pierre, thanks. It's hard to add much to what Jesus said, because it was so on point and well stated, I think, on all of these issues. I'll just touch very quickly on maybe combine the first and second, and spend just a second also on the WTO outreach point. Look, I think on the question of inequality and whether digitalization furthers it, everything that we have seen suggests it's the contrary, right? That in fact, the ability of individuals, of small businesses to be able to be connected, to access markets, to bring their goods to a broader audience, broader consumer base, for workers to be able to connect into opportunities that are beyond what they might immediately face. All of that, I think, promotes more democratization, greater equality, greater opportunities. So we are passionate believers in the power of the internet for, as Jesus said it, for progress, I think, in this regard. The threat of economic nationalism really gets to the points that I was making before, so I won't repeat myself, but I do think that they are quite pronounced in this area. And I think always in times of economic duress, you're going to see that more, and particularly see it in what is perceived to be the next generation of technology. And so bears close watching. And then lastly, on the WTO, and I'm a big fan of the WTO. I do believe that there is, as I mentioned, I think there's enormous opportunity for them to take a real leadership role in this area of digital commerce by bringing the e-commerce negotiations forward and hopefully to a successful conclusion. But I will say, I do think that there is more that there could be done there to communicate more broadly. And at the risk of promoting, of making this a sales pitch for Google or any technology platform, I do think that there is the opportunity to look at tools like YouTube, for instance, or some other communications platforms to help that communication happen more. So we would love to see the next Director General start up their own YouTube channel and get their messages out to the world utilizing technology efficiently and effectively. So I'll stop there, Pierre. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. And if we have time, I would actually ask you your views on the other trade negotiation going on, the time in Paris. It's the negotiation on tax and digitalization. It looks like a negotiation on tax, but if you ask me, it's actually a lot about trade, and also your views on the rise of digital service tax. But anyway, that's if we have time for that. Penelope Haas, you are, as I said, Senior Vice President for International Public Affairs and Sustainability at UPS. You've been patient and listening carefully to our previous speakers. What's your view on this whole? The floor is yours, please, Penelope.
Yeah, so thank you very much, and thank you to all who are participating. I'm here representing, in fact, a broader council here in the World Economic Forum, the Global Future Council on Trade and Investment. And I see some of our members are also participating in this call today. So I think to build off of some of the points I heard, but maybe to bring a slightly different angle to it, when I think about what's going on, and we at UPS are watching the trade trends going, like many, we've been and seen the devastation that this has taken, not only on individuals, but on companies. But what's moving in our network continues to be a lot of essential items for societies and for individuals. And it's coming not just from the traditional brands, I think, as was cited earlier, but we've also seen an incredible entrepreneurial spirit that has also tapped into and used our network during this crisis. So we have seen a lot of small and medium-sized companies come in to the market in a way that was unique and different. And I think that there have been some green shoots that we need to be mindful of that have come about because of this, that we need to think about how we allow them to continue and we continue to tap into them. So an example, at least in my experience, is that we've seen masks that you couldn't get masks for a long time. So you saw individuals, entrepreneurs come up and start sewing masks and selling them on platforms. And on certain platforms, you could find tens of thousands of people selling masks, homemade masks at certain points. And in markets in developing countries, you saw people growing vegetables and going to markets and selling them at a time when there may have been other shortages or impacts that were taking place. So there is a spirit there, I think, that when it comes to the crisis, that has been an upside that I think we need to be mindful of. I think another thing that we would point to, and that we haven't talked about but goes into the inclusive trade, is that the impact of this crisis has disproportionately impacted women. And so when you look at the sectors, both that are exposed to COVID, so the healthcare sector, the care sector, the child care sector, you see those are sectors that are disproportionately female employees. So they're exposed to it. But then when you look at also where job losses have taken place, it's also been in service sectors that have predominantly been places where women work. And so I think that there's an opportunity coming out of this crisis, and I think Karan has mentioned it, as has Jesus, that there is an opportunity to maybe think differently about how we want to continue to empower some of these incredible things we've seen by shifting some of the pre-existing conditions that are out there, and taking advantage of those opportunities. And so part of that's going to be training and skills, and part of that's going to be the enabling environment around some of these companies. How do you use the financing? How do you correct the digital divide in some of the places where there has not been the internet connectivity that's been needed? And I think those are all things that we can think about when it comes to the WTO reforms, when it comes to some of the other reforms that are ongoing. How do we look at some of those unconscious biases or pre-existing conditions and reconfigure them a little bit to ensure that some of these great things that we've seen in these devastating times are preserved. So with that, I'll stop. I know we've got a limited amount of time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Penelope. We have one question to you, but if I may, I would also perhaps, if Jesus and Karen can also step in, it's actually a topic that you brought up, which is the gender dimension of our conversation. The fact that indeed women has been disproportionately impacted, both in the sector that are experiencing overheating, such as the care sector, but also those that have been precisely been hit hard. So if you could elaborate a bit more on that. But I would not necessarily exclude Jesus and Karen. Please, Penny.
Yeah, no, so actually just before this panel, there was a great side event on women and gender where the ITC presented their report sponsored by the UK government with regards to how to mainstream gender into trade agreements. And I think there was, in the discussion, a lot of great ideas with regards to how to look at trade agreements in a different way. Gender is not an issue that's inherently discriminated against. It's not that trade agreements are written to say only men can take advantage of trade agreements, but there are some things that are inherent to it. We at UPS have been doing a ton of training of women entrepreneurs, and financing remains an enormous issue. Not just access to trade finance, which I think everybody is experiencing some shortages at the moment, but general cash flow, how to tap into that has been an incredible issue. So I think that there's some things that we can look at to continue to ensure that the enabling environment around trade, as well as trade itself, does not create any kind of bias, and that we are using these fantastic digital tools and services that are now more digitally traded than ever to take advantage of that. So, I mean, I'm an American-Danish dual family. And so during the crisis, we had a fantastic opportunity for my kids to get a lot of Danish education 6 hours later or earlier, but still. And there's now a ton of opportunity out there. How do we tap into that to make sure that that we can keep the good stuff going? Thank you.
Tusind tak. Jeg må sige, utrolig glad for at høre det. I'm actually also Danish by origin, but I don't look it like it. Anyway, sorry, that was completely personal. No. Jesus and Karen, do you want to step in on this very important dimension issue of gender?
I would just say, Pierre, I think Penny put it very well. I not to sort of point to technology and trade in technology facilitated by trade as being the solution to everything, but I think this is a point very closely related to the broader inequality point, which is what we've seen is that when you can equip women, particularly women in disadvantaged situations, with even the most rudimentary of technology, a basic smartphone, when there are the rules and the financial capability and so forth to do that, it can be life-changing. It can enable them to earn an income. It can enable them to build communities, to remain connected. So to the extent that trade does that, to the extent that trade rules drive prices lower, enable technology to be connected. We've seen this. We've been working very much with remote communities of women in India, for instance, and have just seen it to be life-changing. So again, I think it's a really important point, and it's a filter that we need to be looking at all of our trade rules on.
Thanks very much, Karen. last but not least, perhaps let's move on to our. Oh, sorry, Jesus, do you want to comment briefly on the agenda? Or
Well, not really. I mean, I think there are very important issues that can be discussed there. I would see it more important element as a result of open trade, inclusive trade, development, and all that. Using it on the other side of the table to affect how trade is conducted. I think for each instance of a good application that you have in practice, you might have two of misuse of the issue. For example, do you want to punish countries for having social inequality, for example? We want equality, we want a fair society. If through trade you could enhance measures to promote more equality, you want to do it. But if you do it as a condition for trade, you may end up hurting the objective that you want to promote. So I would be more on the side of promotion, cultural support for the issues on something that belongs, I'm sure Penelope would agree, primarily and mostly to policy by individual governments. It is governments that have to take the action, take this seriously, and push it forward. If you do it on the border, you may, as often as not, be hurting the cause, as in the example that I gave. So maybe a lot more discussion can illuminate whether there are some ways in which it could be done. But basically, I would be careful because social issues generally are maybe the most important thing in society, but not exactly amenable to treatment at the border treatment as in trade.
Thank you, Jesus. Our session is coming to an end, and I'm very pleased to introduce our last speaker for concluding remark, Phil Hogan, Commissioner for Trade at the European Commission. Thank you for your patience. Commissioner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pierre. And I'm delighted to be invited to be part of this discussion and to join with your other speakers, Karen and Jesus and Penny. And I've been listening a bit to the last while of the conversation. It's very interesting. Of course, I want to thank the World Economic Forum for inviting me, but it seems a long time ago since January in Davos, where we had some discussions at that time. A lot of things have changed, and we were hearing at that time about some virus in China, but little did we know that it was going to have such an impact on European and the global economies. So it has thrown everything into analysis and thrown everything into the spotlight in terms of how it highlights our vulnerabilities and the provision of basic services like health products and pharmaceutical products, but also it also has demonstrated how resilient global supply lines are, particularly in relation to food and medicine. And, I remember how well people were panic buying in early weeks of the pandemic when supermarket shelves were largely empty because of this buying. So thankfully that is not the case today, but I think it's fair to say that without the trust ultimately shown by consumers in our global supply chains, the pandemic would have been a true disaster. So I think the time is certainly ripe to have a discussion about societal dialogue and understanding in relation to trade. We have already instigated a trade policy review in the European Union, which we will complete this year to take account of the new circumstances. So I have often said that when it comes to trade and trade policy, we only hear from the winner, or we only hear from the losers, and rarely from the winners. That's why even before the coronavirus, I made it one of my priorities as the Trade Commissioner to improve our communication around trade. So if we construct a positive narrative, of course, that people can relate to, a narrative that really highlights the value added of trade for consumers and business people alike, well, then we have a much bigger buy-in for the various trade agendas for the future. So, and make no mistake, trade agendas around the world will have to change. They're going to change. And I think that COVID-19 is a transformative moment in trade history and in world history. And it's too early to say how this will become and how it will be then defined by what we call the new normal. But we have to have a conversation around it in the coming months and in the coming years. In fact, even already we are engaging a discussion through the form of teleworking and digitalization. And this is going to be probably the new norm as well in terms of how we interact with each other. Rather than having to go to conference centres around the world physically, we can do so much in this way that we are doing today. Companies, of course, that offer workers the right mix of flexibility, incentives, and supports will be the big winners, I believe, going forward. Therefore, digitalization is going to be very prominent. Personally, I also believe that many people will be more minded to support climate and the environment following COVID-19. The lockdowns all over the world have afforded people a snapshot of what a cleaner, greener planet looks like, and we already see the impact on pollution, emissions, and it may lead to greater support for sustainability strategies in various member countries. So we have an opportunity to mainstream into the societal dialogue how trade policy impacts on these largely important issues, how we can integrate the Sustainable Development Goals and the climate agreements into the way we do our business around trade. And companies, I think, are receptive to that now. In the European Union, we like to say that trade is not just about trade. And I think this is a message that will resonate fairly well around the world post-COVID-19. When it comes to the global trade and commercial picture, we have to strike a delicate balance. Many countries are eager to use the pandemic to go down blind alleys of protectionism and economic nationalism. This is, in my view, the wrong direction. And we have to be steadfast in resisting this approach. And I do think that global regions should be given the space to build strategic stockpiles of essential products, allowing them to be better prepared for future pandemics and for similar crises. However, this must absolutely not come at the expense of impeding global supply chains. We have to do both. So access to healthcare products is vital, particularly for vulnerable countries who don't have the appropriate manufacturing capacities. That is why the European Commission now are proposing an international initiative to facilitate trade in healthcare products with a group of WTO partners. A future agreement could facilitate trade in healthcare products and contribute to being better prepared for future health shocks. We could look at issues like abolishing tariffs on pharmaceutical and medical goods, establishing a scheme of global cooperation in times of health crisis, covering issues such as import and export restrictions, covering customs, transit, public procurement, transparency. These are the type of agenda that we could work together on. And we have reached out to like-minded countries in the WTO. But of course, we have to improve the WTO rules as well, make them more effective, efficient, and adapt them to the 21st century trade. It's 25 years ago now since it was the WTO was formed. So a lot has changed. A lot has changed in 6 months. So we have to adapt to this new reality about greening our trade policy and also the role that digitalization will play. So the WTO rules have to reflect on that. And I think that will have to become a bigger priority for whoever is the Director General. We'll have to do a lot more work in relation to this with the membership. Of course, the WTO was already in crisis before the pandemic, and the lack of a global referee that we can trust in the form of a Director General is even more important today. And I'm delighted to see that so many candidates are offering. This gives everybody a choice. I'm sorry there's not a European candidate, but this is the way it is. But WTO reform, irrespective of whether there's a European candidate or not, is still going to be something that's urgent. And hopefully we will be able to work together in the European Union with the successful candidate, which we hope will not be delayed too long, and that we will get the job underway of reform and make it whatever adjustments we have to make, that we do start to work with the new Director General in 2020. So a strong WTO will help, and it's essential that we have it to help a truly resilient global economic situation from the ashes of COVID-19. We want an economy that protects workers, companies, and supply chains. We want an economy that is more to drive the climate agenda, the digitalization agenda, and we want an economy that safeguards international trade rules, keeping our markets open, discouraging import and export restrictions. And we know from the last crisis and the financial crisis that many of the restrictions put in place at that time, some of them are still there. So we don't want the same to arise on this occasion. So the issues that I've mentioned are certainly subjects that require a lot of societal dialogue between policymakers, businesses, and citizens. That is why the European Union, as I said earlier, is conducting a review of our trade policy and to reflect the changing world. So the results of our 12-week consultation will feed into adoption of a communication later this year. And the effect of the review of what we're trying to do is to strike the right balance between a Europe that's open for business and a Europe that protects its people and its companies in certain vulnerable areas and certain areas where we need to diversify. So this type of transparent and inclusive consultation is essential for the times we live in, and we are open to listening to our stakeholders and our people and engaging with them in the coming weeks and months. So thank you again for the invitation, Pierre, to participate with your esteemed colleagues on the panel, and I look forward to seeing you all again physically.
Thank you. Merci, Monsieur le Commissaire, if I may. I guess we can, I don't know how we do a virtual of applause, but I'd like to, at least on behalf of all the audience, thank our panelists, Jesus Seade, Undersecretary for North America, Secretary for Foreign Affairs of Mexico, Karen Batel, Vice President, Government Affairs and Public Policy of Google, Penelope Nas, Senior Vice President, International Public Affairs Sustainability at UPS, and last but not least, Phil Hogan, Commissioner for Trade. I think personally this was a very dense, very useful conversation. 1 hour, but one very useful hour, if I may say so. With that, I'd like to also thank the World Economic Forum, a good forum that can actually bring and increase the quality of the conversation for all the stakeholders. Thank you to all, and with that, I'm closing this webinar. Thank you.